you, Brigitte, for the introductions, and thank you all for coming today. It's kind of important that we have the opportunity to talk a little bit about our future, and in essence all believe that we have a strong role to play in determining where we're heading at this point in time. And I think it's really important also that you realize this is the beginning of a conversation. It may already have started, but I really want for it, in essence, to be further catalyzed by the thoughts that we might throw out today and your interest and input in a variety of different areas. And the reason I say that is that, as you all know, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few months, we're going to be undertaking a strategic planning process this current year, which is essentially going to take us for the next 5 years and lead us in a direction that I find to be pretty exciting. But in order for us to be able to do that, it's probably important for us to think about the next 20 years or next 30 years and to be able to work backwards from that very far point rather than thinking about tomorrow and incrementally building up to that 5-year point. So I want for us to be sort of bold in our ideas and thinking about the future. And what I mean by that is that we're at a really fascinating point in time in terms of higher education for a whole variety of reasons, and hopefully we'll touch on some of those today, but I really hope that you will go away thinking and talking about some of these impacts that really are going to drive our directions for the next decade or so. So, for example, on the national front, we are under the microscope for a variety of reasons. Is higher education worth it? What are we training our students for? And how can we show that we're adding value to that student's life? And what does that mean for us? The second thing is students. Students are not the same as we might have imagined 40 years ago. 40 years ago, we were a much more homogeneous group of learners. And now we're very different. You only have to look in time slices of 5 to 10 years to realize that we have different generations of people. We talk about Generation X, Generation Y, Millennials, Alphas, etc., etc. And there's a whole difference between those students, their expectations of us, their learning styles, and their needs, and their long-term goals, and what in some sense is important to them. And then also fold into this mix the idea of technology and how that's changing the world around us. And when you start to think about it, and you think about higher education, we're at this really fascinating point in time, which is probably akin to when Gutenberg invented the printing press. That was probably the most significant progress that was made in education in terms of making material more accessible to people. Now we're able to have access to information freely around the world. Okay, we kind of started out we were able to draw on walls in caves and show information that way. We were able to develop a common language. We were able to write. We were able to then develop books, and now we're able to put that information out there. So this is really an important advance. So all of this is hitting us at once. And then think about what is the role of a community college in all of this. And it's fascinating to think that we're not the same as we were 50 years ago when we were formed. We are an institution that provides 1-year certificate programs, 2-year associate degree programs. We're also able to provide GED, adult basic education, English as a second language, workforce development, retraining, community education, small business development. We're in essence this huge gravitational attractor for people who are seeking out knowledge and furthering their education. If you don't want to go to a 4-year school, we're it. It's a huge responsibility. And then on top of that, just folding in, as I said, the idea that the students that we serve are not just the students straight out of high school, but they're also students who are coming back to be retrained, who have different learning styles and different motivations. So those are really important as we think about those things. Over our 50 years, we've trained 1.2 million people in one shape or form. We're also seeing, as Joel reminded us, that the economy is making education a commodity, and people are shopping for value. So we're seeing more and more students coming to us as a value proposition. 40% of the graduating class from Portland State started with us. And so that dispels the myth about community colleges and the quality of the education that we provide and the types of students who come here. So all of those things are swirling around in the air, which makes our lives really fascinating. And so that's why we want to try to gel some of these things together to help, in essence, project ourselves forward. So that's kind of what I want to set the stage about today, and hope it gets you thinking, because we're relying on you to ask questions of us as the meeting goes on. But let me throw out the first question, and maybe I'll ask Joel about. So, students, value proposition. Tell us about community colleges and how that plays into to what we do and what we should be doing.
Okay. So, this is a karaoke microphone. Well, one thing I can say is that I think we know that we're in trouble when we start inviting economists to come and talk to people about the future. But part of the reason I say that is because we tend to dwell on some pretty dismal and pretty depressing topics, and I think that that had myself included, but I would also say that we're not nearly as depressing group of people as climatologists or energy physicists. And part of the reason I mention that is because what I see as we project down the road 20 or 30 years, I see these issues of climate change and global resource depletion as being extremely pressing. And I think it's going to bear down on just about every agenda that you can imagine. And so what I think is going to be very important for us as we look down the road, as we look down the future, to see this agenda working its way down through public policy, through technology, through the kinds of business models that we develop, economic policy, right on down to workforce training imperatives. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think that we can embrace these changes in a very positive and proactive way. But I think what would be a bad thing is if we don't, like if we just sit passively and just react to some of these problems and these crises that come down the road, in this sort of, like putting out one fire after another. And so, given that we're going to have to change, virtually everything that we've come to understand about workforce training and what that means in terms of entering people into, productive employment, that we really have, a strong sort of imperative to make some long-term planning. And in my field particularly, I see, we have to completely change the way we teach economics. That the growth imperative is like this normative assumption that goes through just about every textbook in economics discipline. And that's something that eventually is going to change. And when that does change, pretty much everything else that follows is going to change as well.
So I think one of I'm just trying to leave some threads hanging for people to pick up on. So I think the other idea is about change and what are we training students for. And in some ways, as fields evolve, sometimes we're also training people to adapt to change rather than teaching them the material issues. And I think the other thread to leave is the way that we teach. And I love the comment saying, what if we don't? And we've had this dialogue for quite a amount of time about, so distance learning, so we don't like it, people will say it. And then the answer is, well, what if we don't do that? Other people will. And then, you know, the laws of business take over, and people will see distance learning as something that's attractive to them. And so those sorts of things come into play as we talk about the future. But let me ask Joe a question about first generation students. One of the things that is important for us is to keep students with a focus or a goal on getting as much education as possible. And yet it's particularly difficult for us in terms of getting first generation students to feel comfortable and to feel that college is and should be on their radar. So how do we build that culture?
I think one of the answers to your question has to do with, just as we're talking about students adapting to change, I think our institutions need to adapt to the change, the demographic changes that we're seeing. Obviously in this state we have increasing number of Latino students, other students of color, significant percentages now. And again, I think that not only then are we talking about changes outside, we need to think about how do we need to change, how does the institution of community colleges need to change to be more culturally appropriate, accepting, and so on. I think that it isn't just a matter of bringing students here, it really is a matter of having retention systems. It's also a matter of having student support systems. It's a matter of having faculty. It's a matter of having staff that reflect the same culture of the people you're bringing here. So I mean, all of those kinds of things will eventually help the system to change and adapt to what it should be. I do want to come back to another thing about some of the global changes, if you will. I mean, I want to speak specifically about immigration. And I don't mean immigration so much as the Latino population here and issues around driver's license and so on. What I'm talking about is immigration as a global workforce issue. And, you know, again, locally we tend to think right away of what's happening in our backyard, but clearly it is a global issue, and it has to do with change again. It has to do with changing demographics. Most of you out there look like you're younger than I am. But we have to realize that in the next, right now, in the next couple of years, 25% of our population in the United States will be over 65 years old. That's happening around the world in terms of the Northern Hemisphere. So Europe, all of these countries that were basically white are aging, and their birth rates are going down. So these countries, these Northern Hemisphere countries, they have to rely on immigration. Brown people from Southern Hemisphere countries coming up, and they're not just coming up to take jobs that other folks in those countries have already, but rather they're the ones that are really supporting those folks who are retiring and getting older. So it's a dynamic that is global, and it's one that we see it here in this country, but we have to appreciate what are the underlying dynamics of that kind of immigration issue. And it's not so much a matter of we don't want these foreigners, blah, blah, blah. It really has to do with we need a workforce that is healthy and educated so that it can support the community and make a viable society for all of us. So anyway, I just wanted to raise that issue as another way of thinking about the current concerns we do have about change.
And I think you make many good points, and I think one thing in particular is that we're an industry that's not very good at change ourselves. So when you say that we need to change, we have to change the way we teach economics, or we need to change the way that we approach our interactions with students, I think is really important. So as part of that, retrospective look at what we do and how we do it and how we will need to do it. So the question then comes of you, Maria Cristina, in terms of what do students see in terms of their educational needs and how are they best met by a college? So looking at technology is a good example of that, or the personal interaction with faculty members and all of those sorts of things.
I think that as Representative Gallegos and Joel mentioned earlier, the demographics are changing, the students are changing, the learning styles are changing. I was a first generation student. I did not have to apply to college. I did not have to write an essay for college. My mom doesn't speak English, so when I went to her and asked her, how do I do this, she was not able to help me. So I really think that in the future, PCC has to start for approaching those students, because as Representative Gallegos said earlier, more and more first generations, more immigrants are coming to this country, and many of them are the first generation. Many of them don't know how to approach. Many of them don't even understand the language on the application or what are they supposed to do in an essay. And on classes wide, I think that we have to strive for not only teach our students what is on the textbook, but really teach our students how to think, how to think outside the box, and how to really strive and really think more than what they're being taught. So Joe said something really interesting that struck me as a student, because the two classes I have more difficulty here in Rock Creek is because my professors took the time to tell me, you're not only learning the material, you have to learn how to apply it, you have to learn how to think about the future and how this is going to change on the future and how you can apply it. So we really have to think, I think as PCC really has to think about how we're going to make that happen if PCC is the only option they have. That was my that was my only option when I was coming to school. When I graduated in 2010, I was an undocumented student. I did not have the option. I applied to many schools. I had a perfect GPA, and because of my documentation status, I was not able to go anywhere. I did not receive FAFSA, so I had to drop out of school for the first year and work for cleaning houses and doing other kind of low-paid job, minimum wage, to pay for college. So college was not an option for me. And by the resources I found here at PCC, by support systems, resource centers, and leadership positions, that's the only way I can, through my being able to go with my education. But I think about it. Right now, I'm a documented student because of the deferred action that Obama provided. But in 2 years, I have to think about what is going to happen. And for me, this may be the only option. So I think that, as my other panel members mentioned, we really have to stop fearing change and stop fearing that things change. Things are going to change, and change is inevitable and it's uncomfortable, but as students and staff and professors, we really have to stop seeing change as a challenge, but rather an opportunity.
Great. That's really so many things to pick up on. So let me ask you this question then. So, we can show that students, for example, they start off down a career path, they may graduate with a degree in X, but then they'll change career paths once they've left college, so to speak. And so there's that level of change. There's a change of how we teach in the classroom and the availability of information. And so, we're teaching the students not just the material in the textbook, we're teaching them how to be successful in their second and third careers beyond, being an accountant, for example. And we're changing the way that they learn, and we're trying to instill in them a lifelong love of learning. So how does that change the way that we as faculty members teach and our role that we see for ourselves in, quote, the classroom, whether it be a real classroom or a virtual classroom?
First of all, I want to congratulate Maria on her spectacular academic performance in spite of so many obstacles. Faculty make a great impact on students in terms of, we go beyond teaching, in terms of we are mentors, we are advisors, and we help them every step of the way, whether they stick to the same career or they are changing. And right now, how education was presented 40, 50 years back has changed much. It's more a collaborative environment where there is more interaction in the classes. Students are really knowledgeable, and sometimes it really scares. I don't know, maybe Joel has. Some students know far more than us, so they ask too many questions. We go as faculty as knowledge experts, but there is so much outside now available through internet and others that the time in class, whether it's online or on campus, is really used by faculty to enrich students and to be productive participants when they enter workforce. And workforce is changing also. You know, it's no longer, it has become much diverse. So students should be able to work in an environment which is constantly changing. So most importantly, we should be able to give them critical thinking skills. You know, there is a lot of information given to students and us. So more than anything, through classes, through this educational experience, we should help them to see important information. And you know, there is a lot of distraction too. So how they perceive information, how they process information, that is really important. And communication skills, you know, in the workplace or in school, at home, anywhere, communication skills are important. How someone writes well, how someone speaks well is really important to be successful in life, in workplace. And given to that, if pathways are changing, students need to be more adaptable. And that is something that needs to come from the classrooms too. You know, given a way to think in one way, how would you apply this in a different way? So that's where giving day-to-day experiences as examples, you know, presenting difficult situations at workplace, in the classroom, role-playing, all these become important, and they become a good experience for students. So on top of that, I mean, we also want to provide on-the-job training for students, if possible. I mean, you know, a lot of professions, it's not necessarily engineers, doctors, and teachers who need to go through on-the-job training. We can invite, faculty can invite business members into the classroom, have them speak to students so they know how it is facing different professions, and what skill level set is important for students to face the workplace.
Great. So let me ask this question of Joe and Joel also in terms of the workplace and the future workplace. And I was reading last week a study which said that over the next 10 years we expect that 70% of the jobs that will exist will require post-secondary education. And that in of itself is not so bad, but the issue is getting people into those professions where there are jobs. And in some cases like career technical education or some of the more sort of, I guess, academically rigorous disciplines are less attractive to students. So how do we fill those pipelines, and how do we get students engaged in the excitement of being an engineer, being a physician's assistant, for example, as a career path?
Well, I can start. I would say you need to start pretty early. And my vision of education, I spent 40 years in higher education as a professor. My vision of education is really that it begins, there's studies that actually fetuses actually in the womb can learn. So, you know, I think it just starts. It's a lifelong endeavor. But I think that you're right. I think that the place that we're at right now with regard to education is very critical in the sense that the whole culture of higher education is changing, and we're really looking at liberal arts education as opposed to very specialized kind of education. What do our students really need, not just to survive, but really to take us into the next centuries and so on. And I anecdotally, I could share with you my own personal story, in that my daughter just graduated from the University of Portland with a degree in history. Yeah, with a degree in history. So she's now enrolled at a community college program to get some education that she can use. She's over at Mount Hood College, or Mount Hood Community College. Yeah, so I do think we really need to rethink our whole purpose of education. I mean, frankly, I do hate the idea of giving up on liberal education. I mean, I love the arts and literature and so on. I think they're very important. But again, what is it we really need to look at in terms of what we need? And again, I think we need to stop thinking about education as sort of just, high school, 12 years, or 12 years and then we're through with high school, 2 years. We need to think about education as a lifelong process, and continuing to come back and go do something else, and come back and go do something else.
Joe, anything to add to that?
I think another aspect to this is that what we call the workforce is changing as well, and the traditional model of going to college for 2 or 4 years and then having that just kind of snap into a career someplace is, I wouldn't say becoming obsolete, but it's becoming increasingly problematic. And right now we have somewhere between 10 and 13 million people who are chronically unemployed because that model's not working for them. And so what's happening, just really by virtue of survival, I think, is that there's this entire new independent workforce that's developing out there. People that say don't have the types of jobs that provide health insurance and retirement and that sort of thing, that they're temping, or they're working 2 jobs, or they're working as consultants, independents, architects, or whatever, that are sort of working on their own, and they're actually kind of becoming a force. They're forming organizations that will help them get access to healthcare and things like that. So we can see the evidence that what we call the workforce is actively changing as the conditions in our economy change. And so I think that's also something that we can bring into the curriculum, to be training students not necessarily to just go out and apply for a job someplace, but to actually create their own careers, to create their own business models, or develop a skill base that they can actually just take out into the world and apply. And I think that these types of things are actually working at the community level.
Can I just add one comment? Am I on? Yeah, I guess I am. That I haven't heard yet, and it has to do with values. I think that we really need to work on values as well. And I know that in this country we assume that values are something that families need to give to their children and so on, and it isn't so much a part of schools or government. But I do think that clearly the teaching of values is something that's critical as well. Work ethic. My understanding of young people now is that I'm just very pleased with them, because they have a very strong work ethic. But again, how do we, again, encourage them? We talk about first-generation students coming in, and how do we adapt to that? I think we have to recognize that they're coming in with somebody mentioned, facing tremendous barriers. So how do we capture that kind of value, that kind of personal value that helps them to achieve overcome those barriers, I guess.
Yeah, and so let me pick up on that and ask Cristina and Usha the same question in terms of those skills. So you touched on the idea of liberal arts, and I really think that's critical in many ways, because it goes back to the idea of teaching things that are outside of a particular discipline. So you may want to be an engineer, but there are some things like communication which are really important to be a successful engineer that we're starting to realize need to be involved in terms of the engineering curriculum. So for example, in your case, you want to be, your goal is to be a physician's assistant, and you seem to be well on the way to being successful in that regard, and you may change your mind. But what's going to make you be, the best physician's assistant, and make you stand out from everybody else? And Usha will chime in and say, and how we're going to teach that. So.
I think that when you have the opportunity to do internships and get the practice, and an example in my case is student leadership. I think student leadership really has helped me develop me as a student and as a person, and develop the values that I will need one day for the workforce. There's that experience that you don't get in a classroom, the public speaking, the meetings, agendas, all of these different skills that once I graduate from college, it will set me somewhat above or differentiate me from other students, and I think that is something that we really have to look into, giving students the opportunity not only to work in the classroom but outside the classroom. How is PCC partnering up with community partners, business, hospitals, anything where a student can actually get the hands-on experience? I know our Director of Legislative Affairs had the opportunity to go to Salem and do an internship there. That experience is something that she will take on forever, and if she decides to go and do that for herself in the future, nobody takes that away from her. The Bridges program that PCC has with PSU, in which students actually can go and be an intern for the whole summer and do research. I had the opportunity to do that this summer, and it is something that you take on. And I think that we really have to look at partnering up and providing those students, because we do a great job doing it on the classrooms and challenging. I believe PCC does a great job teaching our students how to think and write and do well in the classroom. Now we have to take it one step above and provide them with the opportunities to go and do it outside the classroom.
So Usha, how do we transform the classroom and the extracurricular experience to enable our students to rise above everybody else?
I would like to give an example, and I grew up in India, and this is something that happens in India. Mumbai, a lot of, there are a whole group of people who actually pack lunch. I mean, the households, they pack lunch for this working class. And as soon as the employee leaves home, the spouse or whoever is at home, they start preparing their lunch. And these lunch are given to a network of workers, and they are actually given in stackable stainless steel containers. So you can imagine something like 6 or 7, it's a full course meal. So these are transported by bicycle, and these bicyclists travel anywhere between 20 to 30 miles to go and deliver these lunches at different multi-story buildings. So why am I saying about this? Why am I talking about this? I would give this as an example in my class, because whoever is the bicyclist, it's both an art and a science, what they are doing. First of all, they have to figure out how much traffic there is to figure out if they can deliver the lunch on time. And each of them manages about 40, 50 lunches. How do they transport that many going through all these busy streets? So it's a whole cultural experience for our students even to think about it. And actually, it's a mathematical skill. You know, the starting time, when they would deliver, how many in each office, they have to do a lot of calculation. So this is actually math. So it improves math skills if I give a problem relating to this. So in terms of classroom delivery, there is more conversation going on in the classrooms that really equip students to bring practical experience into the classrooms. So we are talking about not only academic material, but how to apply what is learned in the classrooms. So giving different situational analysis and having students pay attention to detail, that is more important. You know, every little detail is important, but at the same time, how we use information, that is even more critical.
So, your turn. What questions do you have of us as we tackle the whole vast array of issues as we look to our future? So.
And the other question I ask you to come down to the light. Come on down.
All right. I'm fortunate enough to work with student leadership, but I also teach humanities. So I'm glad your daughter got a history degree. They'll serve her well. But I also realize that I have kids that have graduated with Spanish degrees, studied music, history, and they're not doing jobs that I would have done when I graduated. They're having to, my son's a Spanish major, he's now a butcher at New Seasons. My music student is now in our welding program here, so I understand what you're going through, Representative Wright, wanting your kids to get jobs, but I'm thinking more holistically in terms of how do we bring those two goals together so that it's not just those that are privileged enough to get to study the humanities, because it really is a gift, I think, to get to study music and literature and history and not be worried about how am I going to pay the bills. So how do we keep these beautiful subjects alive and important in the higher education process, but match them up with those hard skills that are going to be able to get folks jobs? Because I'm worried that humanities, arts are going to die in favor of the workforce.
Well, you sound like my wife. Well, her, you know, she's very concerned about my daughter, and my attitude though is that, you know, we all sort of go through this. We all sort of find our way, and she'll be so much richer when she finds her way for her understanding of history and her appreciation of history or music or the arts. I think we have to trust our young people to find their way, and it isn't so much that we have to figure out all the answers for them. We need to help them to figure out how to ask the questions they need to ask. I think that's the real challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, my name is Josephine Pino. I wear two hats at PCC. I teach biology. I'm a biology faculty member, but I've also been involved in CTE programs throughout my career, about 17 years, and I'm currently chair of bioscience technology. And I'll have to say, it's a related question / comment. I find it very frustrating when I'm teaching and thinking about the CTE program. We're doing what employers need. We're doing that, we're getting it. We see in the classroom how it works, and we're integrating math and communication work, both verbal, out loud, writing. We're integrating everything. Art, design, we try to do that. And then in my teaching of transferable biology, we are in a traditional siloed model. It's frustrating because I understand in CTE it would be nice if we had more theory and principles behind what we're doing, and I understand in the transfer courses we need more integration. What I've come to realize, especially in the last couple couple of years at PCC, in this giant institution, is we have the ability in our community colleges to put it all together. I talk to Usha in the hallway sometimes. How can we bring business into our bioscience technology classes? I talk to engineers. Can you design something to enable us to do experiments in our bioscience technology classes? I talk to, right now I have a couple students doing research in biology, and they're talking to mathematicians about doing some statistical analyses. These things are very difficult. Usha and I have never managed to figure out a time to actually get together and do it. But we have the power here in our community colleges, much more so than universities, where they're very siloed. At least we're in the same hallways and cubicle areas. So I guess my question would be for Dr. Brown. How do you see the college helping us do this and take advantage of this opportunity?
You know, and I think that's, it's really fascinating that, you know, probably starting about 30 years ago, this question arose in terms of having these silos, if you will. We had at that point for about 100 years stuck in terms of chemistry as chemistry. We don't talk about physics or biology in chemistry. And then we started to think about fields like biophysics or biochemistry or materials science, which brings many transdisciplinary efforts to bear on a certain problem. So I think that's really critical in terms of, you know, we as scientists don't claim that we own all of our field, that there are things that we can learn from approaches made in other fields. So I think it's a really great and fertile ground that we tread on in terms of just having so many smart people around, and yet we don't engage them in dialogues that start to get that cross-fertilization of ideas going that really would benefit us all, and frankly the students also as a result of that. And so I think one of the things that is really important, so I like the idea of how do we bring business or economics principles into a chemistry class, or how do we teach leadership in a biology class, and there are ways of doing that, but we just don't think about that because we're kind of fixated on this is the material I have to teach, and this is what they need to know, and sometimes we have to think a little bit about, well, the material is there, the students can learn it, is how do we teach them how to learn the material, or how to, as you had said, how to go beyond the materials. So we want to be able to teach students to tackle a problem that's not in a textbook, or to take some other way of approaching that. And it may come from the liberal arts. So, you know, philosophy is a great example. I really like philosophy as a discipline. And people who study philosophy, ultimately they end up doing remarkably well for themselves. They not end up being philosophers, they do other things, but they are successful because they have those skills that perhaps go beyond the discipline. And I think we need to start thinking a little bit more about those things. Anybody else want to add to that? Usha, what's your thought?
I just wanted to add that I think PCC, not only PCC, there are other places around the world which are preparing students just vocationally, like they are more technical programs. So given the limitation in terms of time and money for the students and trying to do the best, making it all-rounded program for them, we are really striving hard to see how to balance the technical expertise that is brought in the program along with all these other critical skills. So it's a balance, and it's really nice that a lot of programs can work interdisciplinary. But I think some change needs to happen at a larger level, that we can bring more interdisciplinary approach in all areas that can work, because out in the workplace, that's how it's done. Even technically skilled jobs do need other skills. So students or anybody entering the workforce needs to be more well-rounded.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Danica here, and I also wear two hats here. I coordinate the Student Learning Center at this campus and also teach in the Developmental Education Department in Writing and Reading. And I think I'm just sort of extending what two colleagues said before. But I think three things. One is I think that one of the secrets about community colleges is that we're not that far in terms of, we have small classes, which is also something that small private institutions have, but people don't really think about community colleges that way as a place where students get to build relationships with their instructors and create a learning community that's much smaller than, say, if you go to a four-year public institution where you're going to have, freshman classes at 300 students. So I think that's one secret strength that we have that we need to build on. And then to kind of extend what Josephine and Mandy were saying, I think that in higher education, I come from a background of teaching in high school and alternative schools, and I think that one of the things that in higher education that sort of gets perpetuated and you're talking about is sort of this false dichotomy between liberal arts and teaching for the workforce. And I think Joel's point that the workforce is changing and that what's happening is people are being creative and kind of combining those skills. I think we need to think about that in our institution as well. And our institution is so big that it's hard to structurally support what Josephine and Usha are talking about. So we can, as faculty, I think you already have faculty here who are, I know we already have faculty here who are trying to create that interdisciplinary opportunity in their classrooms, but it's not currently really structurally feasible, both because of our terms, because of, a lot of structural reasons why. And I think that's where it's like thinking from the top, thinking from the bottom up, I think you have that potential there, and sort of thinking through how can you facilitate that, both through professional development and allowing professional, the faculty here to take that inquiry and bring it to their student in a way that is part of their job and not something that they have to figure out around, despite their job. So I think that would be my sort of more of a comment than a question, but how do we structurally support that? And just one other thing is that sometimes in public institutions, I feel like the idea of supporting faculty or teachers to do that kind of professional inquiry is sort of seen as like icing on the cake as opposed to what is needed to support students. And it's sort of seen as like you're doing something too, you're making it too luxurious for the faculty. And I think that's what we're here for, is to demonstrate and model that inquiry for our students. And if it's not facilitated structurally, it's harder to do that. So I would encourage that.
You want to?
Sure. That's kind of what I was getting at in terms of the values. I think that initial question we talked about in terms of how does the community college system need to change in order to adapt and so on. I think the comment here that it already provides a community that is a bit more amenable to first-generation students, smaller classes, and sort of more of a community sense. I think that's an important sort of cultural appropriateness that will be helpful. I do want to, before we start, I do want to make a comment though about my experience teaching at four-year institutions. I can tell you that I was always thrilled when I got a community college student in my classes. Because most of my students would be traditional students who sat there and didn't say anything, just took notes and didn't ask questions. Not very much unlike the community college students who transferred in. They were always asking questions, they were much more worldly, much more mature, usually having families and much more dedicated to learning and so on. So I really did appreciate them and still do.
Great. Anybody else?
Just wanted to add something about the students who are transferring, like Representative said. I think for the transfer students, they are going from one institution to another institution, so they have, it's almost starting all over. So I think that feeling of starting all over at a different institution, the transition, getting used to that, that's a huge help in terms of comparing them with the native students at the university. And I think community colleges, we do a pretty good job of having the smaller class sizes, giving the individual attention to the students, helping them inside and outside of the class. I think it goes a long way, whether they continue at the transfer institution or they enter the workforce. So we should be really proud of that.
But I think the other side of it, and it goes back to the comment you made in terms of developing a culture on campus, which is one which is more appreciative of change and taking risks. And higher education is probably one of the most risk-averse businesses on the planet. And we didn't get where we are today by taking risks on examinations or taking risks on tests. We kind of wanted to be 100%. We didn't want to fail. But I think it's an opportunity, I think, for us now, as we think about what we do in the classroom, is to try something different and be, in essence, creative in the way that we present materials and do something totally different, but still have the opportunity to try it and fail. But at least we tried and learn from that. And most businesses fail many times before they're successful. We don't do that. We're very, I guess, incremental and thoughtful and deliberative in all of the processes that we do. We don't sort of take an orthogonal path off the main direction. We always just seem to go in a very straight line. So I think it's an opportunity for us to try different things and encourage our faculty to do that. I think we have time for one more question. So.
We have one more question.
Great.
I'm Betsy Julian. I'm the Dean of Science and Technology here at Rock Creek. And I predict that over the next 20 years that there's going to be a changing need for our workforce development and the role of the community college. And I think that there's going to be an expanded role for us in post-baccalaureate training programs, and we are currently really not allowed to do anything that is overtly post-baccalaureate. I foresee a changing need for this as the workforce changes, and I'd like your feedback on whether that is a role that you see for the community college.
Let's take that.
I can, that gives me a chance to put in a plug for the state. You know, I'm just finishing my first year in the legislature, and I have to share with you, I had no idea I'd be there when I retired from the University of Portland. But it's extremely exciting, and I have to share with you that, you know, unlike everybody else, I was very critical of government and taxes and all of that. But I have to share with you that it is very exciting to be in Salem at this time, and whether you're, you know, how excited I am has to do with the fact that most of our major institutions are undergoing a tremendous change right now, and so not just education, but corrections and healthcare and so on, as you know. But I think that education, the changes that we're seeing in education are just so very exciting, and I anticipate that things like Future Connect that we're sponsoring here at the community college level, I mean, those kinds of programs are going to make a tremendous difference in our future in the next 20, 50 years. So, and again, we've mentioned the notion of changing the model of education. I think that's another critical piece. As our baby boomers retire, they're going to be looking for other occupations and so on. So I think this notion of ongoing education is another one that is really critical.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to thank you all for being here today, and I think, as I said before, it's really important that we continue this discussion amongst ourselves, not necessarily in a formal setting, but as you go back to your offices or go about what you plan to do for today and the rest of the week and the rest of the month, and you're sitting watching the Detroit Lions play on Thanksgiving Day and you wish you were doing something else. It's an opportunity for us to think more deeply about what we do. And this is a really critical time, as we're all saying, in higher education, in community colleges, in our state. And we all have a say in that, and we all have a stake in that. So the more that we throw these ideas out there and talk about them, the more successful we'll be in terms of being creative and innovative and continuing our leadership role in the community, and also getting the recognition that we deserve for all of the great things that our students accomplish, as alumni, and our faculty do in the classroom, and the support and everything else that our staff provide. So thanks for being here today, and I think we'll let Brigida wrap that up. So.